Realness, I just kill shit cause it's in my DNA. I got millions, I got riches building in my DNA. I got dark, I got evil that rot inside my DNA. I got off, I got troublesome heart inside my DNA. Bitch, your hormones probably switch inside your DNA. Problem is, all that sucker shit inside your DNA. Daddy probably snitch, heritage inside your DNA. Backbone don't exist, born outside a jellyfish, I gauge. Is it poetry? That's the question I'll explore, along with a few snarks for the state of contemporary literary education. This is Positive Readings, Episode 5, The Reduction of Literature. This video will be a gloss of the essay I wrote on the same topic, which is available on Substack. So if you're interested, please go there and read it in full. In 2018, Kendrick Lamar's album Damn won the Pulitzer Prize. It was the first hip-hop album to do so. Shortly afterwards, the International Baccalaureate added Lamar to its list of prescribed authors in its flagship diploma program. This list is used for its language and literature courses, and it lists Lamar as a poet. The International Baccalaureate is an increasingly popular educational framework that emphasizes rigor and international mindedness. Around the same time that they were declaring Lamar a poet, they also added Bob Dylan to that same list, also in the category of poetry. In the case of Bob Dylan, it seems that his canonization was the result of the Nobel Committee awarding Dylan the Prize of Literature. I must take a moment to note that I find it unliterary, at least in the from the perspective that as I see literature, and the spirit that I see literature, in canonizing writers based on awards received. These awards are often political, and rarely do they take in consideration the traditions that these artists are working within when they develop their works of literature. Doubtless, the conflation of these two, awards and literary greatness, is a species of credentialism, the institutionalizing of all areas of modern life. While this topic is certainly an interesting one, I'll have to abandon it here, for it is outside of the scope I intended in this video. The inclusion of Kendrick Lamar's lyrics as poetry in a literary curriculum raises several questions. Are Lamar's lyrics poetry? Should they supplant other conventional works of poetry or other conventional works of literature, or should they simply supplement them? These questions lead to the concept of the canon, which is a often despised concept, but not an irrelevant one. And it also leads to the concept of the classic. It may be helpful then to begin with some fundamental questions or foundational questions, like what is a classic of literature and what is poetry? To investigate this, I'm going to appeal to some sources and some others who thought about these same questions. So regarding the classic literature, the 2003 Nobel laureate for literature, J.M. Coetzee, has the most articulate and interesting response to this question that I know of. For J.M. Coetzee, a classic is simply a work that has survived. Now, what does he mean by that? Coetzee identifies a classic as being a work that has, quote, passed the scrutiny of hundreds of thousands of intelligences, end quote. So for him, this work has survived by being criticized, and it has passed through a number of scholars and critics before him. So this is an interesting way of looking at the classic, and for Coetzee, he says this establishes a paradox. So it's worth looking at the longer quote, the longer passage the longer conclusion that he makes on this topic. So I'm just going to quote here. Coetzee claims, quote, "The classic defines itself by surviving. Therefore, the interrogation of the classic, no matter how hostile, is part of the history of the classic. inevitable, and even to be welcomed. For as long as the classic needs to be protected from attack, it can never prove itself classic. So the paradox would seem to be that a classic needs to be interrogated, needs to be criticized, needs to be pulled apart, so to say, by people maybe who don't like it in order to prove itself as a classic. So within this theory that James Coetzee presents, the critic is, what he says, is duty-bound to interrogate the classic. Their job is to look at these works, look at their shortcomings, and if they're truly great, they will survive the attacks and criticism leveled against them. Therefore, really, it's our duty to read carefully, think deeply about the works we're reading, and speak our opinions about them bravely. I'm not stating that Kendrick Lamar's lyrics are classic. Obviously, it's too early to say that. But I believe our critique of them, and looking at whether they're even poetry and they should be treated as such, should be welcomed by the International Baccalaureate and any other teacher and student of language and literature for the very reasons that James Coetzee sets down for what a classic is, and I would say by extension, what a great work of literature is. For those who find the survival argument a bit unrealistic or perhaps abstract, it's important to keep in mind that at his death in 1891, Herman Melville's 1851 novel, Moby Dick, enjoyed none of the popularity or reverence or opinion of it being a great work of literature that it enjoys today. It was out of print by the time he died, and even during his lifetime, it sold a little more than 3,000 copies. It essentially ended his career as a novelist. When Moby Dick was first published, contemporary reviewers savaged it. They thought it was bizarre and too far of a departure from his previous work, not a work that would stand the test of time. However, future critics saw something in it, some kind of greatness that was worthy of preservation, and more importantly, readers did as well. And it has survived that criticism and has become a classic, just as Mr. Coetzee speculated or theorized for what the classic is. Now, I don't believe Moby Dick is as popular and widely read today as some bestsellers or popularly assigned course readings, but I'm sure that it will outlive those works, and its reverence for Moby Dick will continue. Relatedly, in elaborating on this concept of the classic, Moby Dick has gone on to inspire other great authors and great works. This could include William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. So we could add to our definition of the classic that the classic is a great work that goes on to inspire other great works. Now, it's probably too early to claim that Lamar is his lyrics are classic, but we could ask ourselves, what tradition is he working in? Has he gone on to inspire, or has he been inspired by other poets? Is that the lineage he's working in, just as we have the Moby Dick to Faulkner and Ellison link? We could also make the obvious observation that Lamar doubtless has and will go on to inspire other hip-hop artists. I'm sure that's something he's doing presently. I'm sure lots of singers look up to him and his lyrics for inspiration. So within that, maybe the larger question that could come up is the literary community claiming hip-hop and their lyrics as part of its sphere, right? Now, I don't know if I'll answer that question here, but that's something at least I think gets brought up when we're thinking about Lamar's lyrics as poetry. So to summarize, our working definition so far of a classic is a work that survives harsh criticism because there's something in it that future generations of readers find valuable, and it speaks to them in some way, and also a work that goes on to inspire other great works, which is related to the first response. And I might also add to this that, like music, a classic or a great work of literature should transcend things like nationalism and other tenuous constructs. Now, all of these elements in our definition imply a tradition that the works are developing in, expand in, and perhaps even radically revise in, especially in the case of some of those works, like I mentioned, whether it's Moby Dick or Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. Now, to get to our second question, what is poetry? The definition of poetry is going to be a bit more complex, and perhaps maybe even more complex than it should be, as most of us think that we recognize poetry when we see it. Perhaps the simplest thing we can say about poetry is that it does not resemble how we speak and write in our daily lives, and often it takes a form that is impractical for communicating information that like we would in our daily lives. Now, even this assumption, I believe, is sometimes challenged, and I think most recently by a current best-selling poet, Rupi Kaur, who many people maybe argue that it's not poetry that she's writing. So her poems often take the form of simple declarative sentences that are devoid of punctuation, capitalization. They might seem more like a precocious text message than free verse experimentation of poetry. But again, this is something that's been put forth as poetry. Another thing to think about when we're deciding what is and what is not poetry. On the question of what is poetry, like I did with our first question, I'm going to look at other sources, authoritative sources, to see what they thought. So one, I'll look at Harold Bloom, who is arguably the greatest 20th century critic of literature, also perhaps equally despised for his pushback against what he called the school of resentment. And I'll also look at Jay Wright, who is a unfortunately little-known poet, and was also championed by Bloom and others. Now, Jay Wright, I chose Jay Wright partly because I think he would be a suitable replacement for the lyrics of Kendrick Lamar, assuming that Kendrick Lamar, or at least part of the drive of selecting Kendrick Lamar, has to do with diversity and representation. So I believe Jay Wright would be a better choice if that's one of the factors leading to the selection of Kendrick Lamar. While Harold Bloom has written many works, perhaps too many, arguably his greatest comment on poetry comes from his 1973 book, The Anxiety of Influence. And anyone interested, I would especially recommend the Chapter, which is a manifesto for antithetical criticism, where he provides, I think, probably his clearest theory about what poetry is. Some of the book, I would argue, is definitely a bit opaque and challenging in how it's written, but that will be the section where you'll get the clearest understanding of what he says poetry is. So I'm just going to quote part of this. He claims that poetry is, quote, poetry is the anxiety of influence, is misprison, which is a misreading of other poets, is a disciplined perverseness. Poetry is family romance. So this is the Freudian influence that he's getting. Poetry is the enchantment of incest, disciplined by the resistance to that enchantment. And by incest, he's not meaning literal incest, but between poets, or within a tradition. And finally, quote, a poem is a poet's melancholy at his lack of priority. So this feeling of not coming first, not doing this great thing before someone else did before him. Now, these statements are clearly a bit abstract and obscure, maybe a little challenging, and perhaps seem unhelpful at first. But this is essentially a development of T.S. Eliot's theory that T.S. Eliot presented in his essay called Tradition in the Individual Talent. And it's a rather simple theory. And again, in that inter-chapter, you get a statement that is much clearer and easier to understand. And I'll just quote this here. Bloom claims that the meaning of a poem can only be another poem. So when we're looking at a poem, we're trying to analyze what a poem means, that the meaning is ultimately based on a prior work that the work was inspired by. Okay, so within that theory, again, we see that tradition is important. The poem, in that sense, for Bloom and for Eliot, exists in a lineage. So the poem is essentially, we can almost think of it as its style as phenotypic features and this DNA being passed down through the lineage to form the work. Okay, so and of course there's mutations along the way, and that might be a helpful analogy as to think of his theory. Like Bloom, J. Wright also centers tradition and the discipline when he's defining a poem or the poet, but he leaves more space there for other things like hip hop lyrics. So J. Wright interestingly says, quote, "Poetry is what a particular literary community at a particular time says it is." Right? So he's acknowledging that poetry is largely going to be defined by what the group of people at the time is saying, hey, this is the poem. So it's a little bit more of a community-based definition. So tradition, yes, important, but also community-based in what they're saying a poem could be. And he also adds to that the poem, quote, attempts to establish itself as a member of that class of things we call poems, and thereby establish a paradigm. So what do we call poems? What we call poems today may be things like Rupi Kaur is writing, or it may be the lyrics of Kendrick Lamar. So that's the argument he's making. But the one thing that he says, all of these poets, or he calls them, I think, practitioners of verbal art. So it doesn't have to be just a traditional poet. But he says that the one thing that they should all share is, and I'll quote this here, they will encompass any number of various paradigms, so different styles and forms that will come out. But what remains common to all of them is the urge to express within them the claim of history, vision, and spirit. And now that is a bit abstract, but I think what he's saying here is that they should be kind of engaging with the times, critiquing the times, as we expect, I think, from a lot of art. It's a cultural form that we engage with and hopefully allows us to understand something more about our culture, but through that, life in general, the experience, the condition of being alive. So as we can see with J. Wright, especially this idea of the paradigm and a writer establishing a new paradigm or working within a paradigm and changing that, and then that other factor of poetry being what a literary community says it is, we can see that hip hop lyrics or Kendrick Lamar's lyrics could certainly be contained within that definition. So I started my point of this topic from this intuitive perspective or intuitive belief that I had that poetry or that hip hop lyrics and or lyrics in general were not poems or not poetry because they did not work within this tradition of poetry. They did not. They weren't inspired by this tradition of poetry. They weren't expanding it, and they weren't, developing it and changing it. I'd have to concede now that I could be wrong on that the poetry could be essentially anything that the literary community says it is at the time. However, like Mr. Coetzee says, I think there's plenty of room there for criticism and pushback to say that hold on, maybe this isn't poetry, and this is something that I think is part of the establishment of not only the literary community, but also of what a great work can be. So that's partly what I think I'm aiming for here as well in this video. So has the literary community declared Lamar a poet? That I think is unlikely presently, even though the IB has. But I don't think it's unlikely that in the future, perhaps Lamar will be considered as a poet and will be taken into that that literary community. It's not unreasonable to think that contemporary poets and certainly future poets will find Lamar's lyrics inspirational. For this is something that they likely are listening to, his music, and it could be listening to, and this could be similar to what David Foster Wallace has said that television was a big influence on his work, and also he believed it was a big influence on a lot of postmodern fiction. However, I think we should note or observe that David Foster Wallace thought that this was a worrying characteristic, not something that he celebrated. Assuming that Kendrick Lamar's lyrics are poetry, and that's what we'll assume from now on, the more consequential question is what is to be done with them from the perspective of education? Do they supplant traditional poems and traditional literature? And at what cost do they do so? To put it another way, I think more importantly, a more important way, is by teaching Kendrick Lamar's poetry or lyrics, poetry, do we also teach the discipline of literature? I would argue that teaching the discipline of literature through different works would be the paramount objective that we should have in a literature course. To illustrate some of the reservations I have for teaching Kendrick Lamar's lyrics as poetry, I want to look at King Kunta, which is the third track off of Kendrick Lamar's 2015 album, To Pimp a Butterfly. Now, personally, I find that album to be far more enjoyable than his album Damn, the Pulitzer Prize-winning album. And that song, King Kunta, is probably my favorite favorite track on that album. And I should also mention on the popular lyrics website Genius, this song is the most viewed of the lyrics. So I'm probably not alone in my estimation of this song as being the best on there. So I'm trying to select my favorite song and what I believe is to be the best song until I can really look at what I believe is some of the best work that Kendrick Lamar is doing. So the section of the song I'm going to look for is just the end of the chorus at going into the first verse. So it begins with the chorus, and I'll just read this here. Bitch, where were you when I was walking? Now I run the game, got the whole world talking. King Kunta, everybody wanna cut the legs off him. When you got the yams, what's the yams? The yam is the power that be. You can smell it when I'm walking down the street. Oh yes we can, oh yes we can. I can dig rapping, but a rapper with a ghostwriter, what the fuck happened? Oh no, I swore I wouldn't tell, but most of y'all sharing bars like you got the bottom bunk in a two-man cell. Now, obviously, those lyrics have some humor in them, which I think probably goes a long way in people enjoying them. And, of course, a rhythm. Obviously, I wasn't doing it justice, but if you heard the music with it, you would hear that. But the mention in those lyrics particularly of yam and smelling yams when you're walking down the street have been cited as literary allusions to Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart and Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, respectively. While I believe these references, these literary allusions, will aim readers or listeners to harder-won pleasures and more literary and intellectually challenging experiences, the reading of those works, it does so to what purpose? So will a student who sits down to analyze King Kunta, will they bring knowledge and understanding of Things Fall Apart and Invisible Man to the table? I think it's the former is more likely, considering the greater popularity of Things Fall Apart and the less time investment in reading it. But still, what purpose does it serve, considering that these are referenced, thrown out in the song kind of disjointedly with not a clear connection of thematic intent? The song King Kunta alludes to these works in the service of developing themes of growing wealth, consumerism, and this boastful skill dominance as a rapper over other rappers. And these qualities are at odds with the more reflective, introspective, and moral dilemmas that the characters in Things Fall Apart and Invisible Man have. So it would appear that the writer, in this case Kendrick Lamar, didn't read those works, or just using them as cultural capital, as a reference to an idea, but not to a fully understood idea. Now, I would argue that the classroom is the place for students to focus on these more challenging works, like those novels, like Invisible Man. And in that context of studying, say, Invisible Man, a song like King Kunta could be a valuable supplemental cultural text, a way to connect a novel that was written in 1947 with a popular song from 2015. And by doing that and looking at it, maybe you could understand the context that Lamar is working in, and perhaps some of the intentions that Lamar has in sculpting and creating those lyrics in that song. However, I should note that this process does not really work in the reverse order. King Kunta does not enrich Invisible Man, right? It's going to be knowing Invisible Man and bringing that knowledge and understanding to the analysis of King Kunta that will really be fruitful and helpful. And as far as time management goes, it's much easier to slip in a song to study than a 500-page novel. Whether Lamar's lyrics are in fact poetry or simply a stylistic celebration of consumerism is ultimately the decision of a literary community, the readers, writers, and teachers who are actively engaged in the work of reading, analyzing, and discussing works of literature and culture. However, considering that people today, the average person spends not a lot of time reading, I believe that a classroom can be better used by spending time looking at these more challenging texts that need a guide through them and need to be, or a coach, say, a manager to work through these challenging works. Finally, on the question of diversity and representation, it's interesting to note that while the IB includes the lyrics of Kendrick Lamar, it does not include the works of Ralph Ellison, Jay Wright, Amiri Baraka, or Paula Marshall, whose Brown Girl Brownstones was the focus of episode 1. Now, obviously, a list of prescribed authors, a canon, cannot include all authors, and many great ones are going to be left out. So Melville and Newt Hampson are also not on that list. However, when comparing the constant claim of the importance of diversity and representation, or diversity inclusion, with the absence of those 4 great African American writers I just named, it's hard not to conclude that there's a lack of disciplinary expertise, a lack of reading on the parts of the managers making these decisions, and relatedly, that there's a preference for diversity over quality, and neither of these things are good for education. Let's celebrate greatness where greatness is, and not just where the sales are. or other signs of low-hanging fruit. Let's train our minds so our hearts will be ready for the challenges of great works. And let's critique them harshly. Thank you for watching Positive Read-Ins. If you enjoyed this episode, please like it and subscribe. And if you'd like to read this essay in full, please check it out on the Substack. Reading and culture are choices. Let's choose them.